application development and delivery professionals with Forrester Research. Please give a warm welcome to him. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forwarded a little too much here. My name is Mike Gualtieri, and I cover big data, predictive analytics, and data management topics here at Forrester. And I want to talk to you today about predictive analytics specifically for the workforce. But I also think that it's important, first off, to get grounded in what we actually mean by predictive analytics and why that's a hot topic, and we're talking about it now. There's a few common concerns that people have about predictive analytics, about its maturity, about the data and the people that are needed. I'm going to talk to you about why some of these myths exist, but also show you how they can be overcome in unexpected ways, especially when you focus predictive analytics in a particular domain, in this case, workforce analytics. But before I continue, we have a poll question, so I'll turn it back over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Mike. And this is the first of 3 polling questions that we will intersperse throughout our webcast. And our question asks, which of the following most precisely reflects how you would characterize your organization's ability to use predictive analytics? We will get into predictive analytics in greater detail, but just to get a sense of your own understanding of your organization's ability to use predictive analytics, which you can feel free to do. And again, this question will appear on the left side of your console if you're attending our live webcast. Feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to your choice, and then you would click on the submit button. And the choices from top to bottom are the following. They are: our organization is not mature enough to use predictive analytics. Our organization has not gathered enough information to be able to use predictive analytics. Our organization has not hired dedicated staff, such as, say, statisticians whose expertise we would require to use predictive analytics. Our organization has not made technology investments in-house that would enable us to use predictive analytics. Our organization has not identified third-party software services that would enable us to use predictive analytics. Or, if you're already using predictive analytics, you can feel free to select the radio button next to the bottom choice. But again, we would want to find out, we'd be interested in finding out how you would characterize your organization's understanding of its ability to use predictive analytics. And so far, what we can see is that a plurality have indicated that your organization has not gathered enough information to be able to use predictive analytics. And then it's interesting, the next most prevalent choice that we can see here is your organization is using predictive analytics, but an overwhelming majority have not yet implemented predictive analytics. And this is a great opportunity to segue into our discussion.
Thank you. And hey everyone, Mike Gualtieri here again. One of the things we know, data is a hot topic. Whether you call it data or you call it big data, data has risen to the fore again, especially in IT and technology as well. You can see this survey poll we ran of over 2,000 IT and technology decision makers, and we asked them to rank technologies according to their importance and investment within their firm, and rank 1 and 2. Right to the top there is data-related projects. You can see other things in there like mobile and social and cloud, and their systems of record, which are the application systems, also make an appearance. But isn't it interesting that data-related projects is number 1? Now, data obviously runs through all of these, but it's instructive about how much companies are actually thinking about data. The reason they're thinking about it is analytics. And we're not just talking about traditional analytics, we're talking about all kinds of analytics. And in many cases, the demand for analytics is driven by more sources of data. So when we ask people why, what's the key reason why they're pursuing, or what are the gaps between or inadequacies of earlier generation technology, why are they looking for new techniques, technologies, and applications? The number 1 reason, and you can see it's broken down by business decision makers and technology decision makers, is they want deeper insights through advanced analytics. And I'll get into what that means in a second. I also think it's noteworthy that, number 2 is data volumes, data changes a lot. But if you look at the very bottom, I've highlighted earlier generation technology is too expensive. So this whole big data trend and momentum is not driven by reducing costs. It's driven clearly by the need for deeper insights. And that also proves out in another survey question where we asked about the budget in terms of what people, what budgets are willing to spend in 2014. And you can see that there are increases in categories such as big data solutions, business intelligence, and business analytics. You can also see that mobile and security are up there in terms of budget increases, but big data has made a showing, as well as analytics, a very strong showing on this. So this isn't really keep the lights on investments. These are new investments, again, driven by finding those deeper insights. And you may have heard the term data science that goes along with predictive analytics. And sorry, that slide was a little bit, some of those are supposed to be crossed out, I apologize, but it's basically supposed to say prediction is profit. But you may have heard knowledge is power, that phrase, which was coined by Francis Bacon, who was the father of the modern scientific method, which basically used data to find answers, to have the data prove that out. And that's part of this new data science trend with big data and predictive analytics. And the definition, if you really want to understand what predictive analytics is it's techniques, tools, and technologies that use data to find predictive models. And that is to predict something in the future. Now, the first thing you might be thinking is, whoa, we can't predict anything with any certainty. And that's absolutely true. And that's why the second part of this definition is about probability. Okay, so whenever we talk about predictive analytics, we're talking about probabilities. I think we all know that economists use predictive models all the time, but they're only about 50% right. Very complicated system, lots of data, lots of things changing, right? So that's a rough bet to do predictive modeling on that. On the other hand, predictive modeling can be very useful in specific business domains, including workforce, including marketing. I'll show you some examples in a second. Now, the other reason why we're able to talk about predictive analytics and why it is such a hot topic is big data. And one of the things that you need to get good predictive models is more data. The more data you have, the more likely you are to find these predictive models. And there's no need to fuss about what's the definition of big data. It basically means all of your data. All of the data in your enterprise, and also any relevant data external. And that brings us to a definition of big data, is that it's a particular company's frontier of their ability to store, process, and use all of the data it needs to operate and make decisions. Now, I don't have the slide here, but when we ask people how much of their data are they using now for analytics, the answer is 12%. So when you want to talk about a frontier, there's a huge frontier already, and business executives sense this. They sense that they're generating a lot of data, but they're not getting the value, the insights out of it. So that's sort of responsible for this whole trend of big data. But what are you going to do with that data? And that's really what gets us down to predictive analytics. And that brings us to our next polling question.
Thank you very much, Mike. This is the second of 3 polling questions that we are posing throughout the webcast. The second question asks, which of the following corresponds best to your understanding of the term big data? And so what you can feel free to do, as with the prior polling question, feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to your choice. Then you would click on the submit button. Again, this polling question will appear on the left side of your console, same area as the slides. And from top to bottom, the choices in response to the question, which of the following corresponds best to your understanding of big data, are big data represents a new approach to deriving insights from structured and unstructured data. If that's your understanding, you feel free to select the radio button next to that choice. And then continuing onward, again from top to bottom, big data refers to business intelligence practices, specifically for working with large quantities of data. Big data refers to technological advances that enable organizations to analyze larger volumes of data and at greater speeds than ever before. Big data represents hype rather than substance, or if you don't have an understanding of big data, or what it means rather, you can feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to the last choice. Again, we ask that you select the radio button that corresponds to your corresponds best to your understanding of the term big data. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you a few more seconds to respond. And now what we're going to do is we're going to reveal how you have responded. And so far, what we can see is that looks like a plurality have indicated big data represents a new approach to deriving insights from structured and unstructured data. The next most prevalent response, big data refers to business intelligence practices specifically for working with large quantities of data. And at this stage, I think this is a great opportunity to segue into a further discussion of big data.
Thank you. Mike Gualtieri back again. Well, this is interesting because we actually posed this question in a survey comparing business and technology decision makers. You can see the dark blue are business decision makers, and most technology decision makers get it, and you can see it's an extension of existing analytics practices, and it's also a whole new way of thinking about value. So about 30% of technology decision makers thought that it's an extension and a whole new way of thinking. In fact, it's both of those things. It's an extension and a whole new way of thinking. And some business people also thought that it's a whole new way of thinking, but you can see on the far left that about 30% of the business people think that it's very confusing. They're not sure what it means. So there's a clear gap between what business and technology think, but that gap is closing. It's a significant gap, but it's not a huge gap. So that's quite interesting. So if we ran this survey, and I know we did, I don't have the results here. It was more confusing to more people a year ago. So we're getting past that hype phase, and big data as a term has a lot of momentum. And that brings us back to connecting it back to predictive analytics. There's many sources within an organization referred to structured text, and that's structured information that you might think of in relational databases, unstructured text like email and preform. There's also binary, audio, images. So when we say all of your data, that's what we're talking about here. It's coming and generated by all of your application systems, your finance systems, your customer service, your call center systems, everything. A typical large enterprise might have anywhere between 200 and 600 different applications that they use. They all have data in them. And that's where it brings me back to that 12% point, where firms say they're only analyzing about 12% of their data. There's just a huge opportunity to find value in the data that they're not looking at. One of the key challenges, though, is that a lot of that data is siloed. It's siloed and it's hard to get at. It's hard to get that data together. So that's a key challenge, and one of the ways to overcome that is to focus that analytics on particular domains. And again, we're going to be focusing on the workforce domain here. Now you have to understand what predictive analytics is and how it's different from regular analytics or traditional BI. And predictive analytics, it binds predictive models. There's a model that can predict an outcome. And these can be very powerful if you can predict something, very profitable. But again, they're about probabilities, not about absolutes. So they're only good for problems where a probability will give you an advantage. Okay? There's certain systems, in a hospital, for example, you don't necessarily want a probability. You want a certainty. And predictive models may not exist for every question, right? People try to create predictive models to predict commodities or the stock market with very limited success because those are very complex. So predictive models isn't for everything, but when they work, they give your firm a very strong advantage. A very typical example in a different domain is direct marketing. Okay, so I won't belabor this, but you can see it. A typical direct marketing campaign might have a 1% response rate. So you send a mailing, could be email, to 1 million customers, and say it's $2 per mailing to contact them in some way to sell some $220 service. So you can do the math there, okay? With a 1% response rate, the profit after the investment without all the costs is $200,000, right? Now, if you can use a predictive model, which companies like Capital One and many others use, a predictive model to increase that response rate, you've got a huge profit of $1.1 million compared to the $200,000 profit. And basically, you can create a predictive model to mail it to the 250,000 customers of the million who are most likely to buy. And if that increases the response rate 3%, and this is very typical in many businesses, you're going to spend a lot less contacting those companies, and then your profit explodes, even if you get fewer people accepting it. So that in a nutshell describes the power that a predictive model can be applied to different business domains. And the way to think about this is to understand the difference between the traditional analytics method and data science. So on the left is the traditional way. So let's just say we want to improve a business outcome, and that business outcome is churn. Say we work for a telecom company, and we want a model that predicts which customers are going to leave to a competitor so that we can maybe market to them in a different way so that they don't leave. Okay, so how does that work now? How does that quote-unquote data-driven approach work now? We all get into a meeting. You get people from the retail stores, from customer intelligence, from R&D, all aspects of the company, and everyone kind of just looks at reports and they kind of decide what data is important, what data predicts. Everyone has a different hypothesis or a theory of what data. And then they go off and they tell a business intelligence professional to create a dashboard or a report that reflects what that human-driven data point is. Now, in the data science approach, you don't do that. What you do is you assemble all possible data, and then you run sophisticated algorithms on that data, and those algorithms will find the relevant data, the relevant predictive data. Okay, so that approach is unbiased. It's not biased by what people think is the reason behind churn. It uses the data to find it. Now, both of these approaches are needed, and most organizations have traditional analytics. What they lack is the predictive analytics or the data science approach and the applications that can use that approach. But it's a very powerful approach because it's truly a data-driven approach, getting back to Sir Francis Bacon, in that it's using the data. It's not using people to say what data is important. It's using this algorithmic approach to determine that. So in different domains, for example, this can be very powerful. Here's an example, a healthcare example. On the left, they asked some doctors and psychiatrists what they thought would be the predictors of depression. And you can see the list on the left. But if you look on the right, you can see what data science found are the predictors, and you can see they're very quantitative in this case. Now, the doctors on the left all issue those blood tests, and they look at these levels, but they were unable, because it's so complex, they were unable to correlate it to what predicts depression. So it turns out you can ask all these questions on the left of a patient, but you can do a blood test, and you'll know with a much higher degree of accuracy if someone's susceptible to depression. Netflix famously uses predictive analytics in their recommendation engine. And you might remember a few years ago they put out a prize for $1 million to anyone who can improve those recommendations by 10%. And that's been getting better and better. Their whole business is based upon predictive analytics and the streaming model. Other aspects of this in retail, Tesco, a UK supermarket, predicts the exact date customers will return, individual customers will return, and what they'll spend within $10. They can only do this for 19% of their customers. And that gets down to the probability part of this, but it's still very valuable in terms of stocking, logistics, pricing, and offers. Another example, marketing. You know how during Thanksgiving, everyone markets to, Walmart, Pottery Barn, everyone markets to consumers as if they're all going to be throwing a huge Thanksgiving feast at their home. So it's placeware and it's all that sort of stuff. But that's not true, right? Because some people are going to be guests. So what if a business person in marketing went to their business intelligence group, and they said, hey, I want a list of people who are going to be guests, likely to be guests, and people likely to be hosts. Well, that business analytics person is going to look in their database, and they're going to say, I don't have that information about the customers. I don't have a field that indicates whether someone is going to host Thanksgiving or be a guest. Now, if that same marketing person asked the same question to a data scientist, the data scientist would say, maybe I can predict who's going to host and who's going to be a guest. And think of having that information and how that would change how you can market to customers. Extremely valuable, but requires predictive analytics. Google bought Nest, the replacement thermometer, for $3.2 billion. Why? It has a sensor in there. It records when you're home and when you're not home and how efficient your heating system is, and it predicts when to turn up the heat or turn up the cooling. Google is even integrating it into their phone, so it predicts that you're driving home, and it will turn it up at that time. You might think that's creepy. That's the subject of another webinar. But that's all predictive analytics. And data scientists are generally the ones who do this. So going back to the myths and the difficulty of doing predictive analytics, it often, but not exclusively, does require data scientists, and they use a combination of statistical and machine learning algorithms. It's a very, very hot job. I think Harvard Business Review a year or two ago called it one of the sexiest jobs. And as you can see here, Walmart is looking for data scientists. Maybe your companies are too. They're sort of desperate to get data scientists. They're desperate to get it because of predictive analytics. The thing is, it's not the only way to benefit from predictive analytics. It's not the only way to get it done. Many of the large and many boutique consulting firms can implement predictive analytics projects, so you can hire them on a project basis to do it. But we're also seeing a new class of what we call predictive applications. These are applications that actually already embed the sophisticated predictive analytics. So they've done the data science at their laboratories, and they've incorporated that into their application. Predictive maintenance, asset maintenance. You can buy packages that will predict when engines will blow or manufacturing lines will go down. You can predict, like I gave you the example about the turkey customer experience, obviously the marketing example, and also pricing. What should the pricing be? Recommendation engines like Netflix, and of course workforce optimization, how to retain employees, how to hire them, how to get the best performance out of them. So the fastest way is to look at this class of predictive analytics. But there's another challenge as well, because predictive analytics often challenges the status quo of how decisions are made. When I give you that example of sort of the company's experts hypothesizing why customers churn, for example, many say that that's a data-driven approach, and I put that in air quotes because it's really a human-driven approach. It's a human saying this is the data that matters, versus predictive analytics, which uses very sophisticated algorithms to do that. And so you have to consider that as well when adopting it. Some people may not understand how this works and may be reluctant. So with that, let me turn over to the polling question.
Thank you very much, Mike. And following our discussion, we're going to pose the third of three polling questions, and then we'll continue our discussion. Third of our three polling questions, again appearing on the left side of your console, same area as the slides, is what would be your primary reason to apply predictive analytics to managing your workforce? And you can feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then you can click on the submit button. The choices from top to bottom are improve hiring decisions, boost productivity, increase likelihood of retaining your best employees, support efforts to retain customers. If you have reasons other than those listed above, you can select the radio button that corresponds to the fifth choice from the top. And finally, if you do not plan to apply predictive analytics to managing your workforce, you can feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to the bottom choice. But again, what we want to find out are your responses, or get your sense of what your primary reason would be to apply predictive analytics to managing your workforce. You can feel free to select the radio button that corresponds to your answer, and then you can click on the submit button. So what we're going to do is give you just a few more seconds to respond, and now what we're going to do is reveal how you have responded. And so far, what we can see is that we can see that a plurality have indicated that you would apply, the primary reason you would apply predictive analytics would be to increase your likelihood of retaining your best employees. Also tied is boosting productivity. So that's quite interesting. And actually, this is a wonderful segue, once again, to Mike Gualtieri's discussion.
Thank you. So now we'll just look at a couple of specific workforce, because remember I said, predictive analytics isn't good for all applications. Like, yeah, let's go run out and do a predictive model for the stock market. We'd love to do that, right? But it just doesn't lend itself that well to a system as complex as that. But the marketing example I gave you, where it boosted profitability, marketing is a great area for this. Another area, it turns out, which is a great area, which is why we're talking about it, is workforce. It applies very well. Predictive analytics works very well in workforce. It can be used to make better hiring decisions in the recruiting process. It's very costly to hire people, and that person you hire has an impact on essentially everything you do, and especially the performance. It can also figure out it can predict what are the key factors which will boost productivity of individual employees. It can help you retain the best employees, figure out which, essentially can score employees in terms of their value in their particular thing. And, of course, the employees have a huge impact on customer experience and satisfaction. So it can also be used to predict what are the best ways to improve how employees improve the customer experience. So, fortunately, predictive analytics lends itself very well to workforce. So when you're thinking of implementing predictive analytics, like I said, it has applications across the board, horizontally in a company, and there's many ways of going about it. So you should pursue predictive analytics everywhere, but when you prioritize anything, you often prioritize the most valuable resource, and for most companies, that is their workforce. That's one of the biggest cost items, and this is the one that has the biggest impact in all other aspects of the business. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Housman.
Great.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mike. It was really interesting, and I think that the audience is going to hear a lot of those themes run parallel through my section. So by way of background, with Evolv, we're a company that's very focused on applying big data and predictive analytics to the workforce. I'm actually going to talk more about that in a second. We've broken down this agenda into 4 pieces. So first, I want to talk at a very high level about big data, but Mike did a great job covering that. And so I'm going to speak specifically to how big data and predictive analytics can be applied to the workforce. We'll then take a step back. I want to introduce Evolv, our platform, give the audience a sense of what we do. We'll talk about some specific use cases. I think the most interesting way to learn about this and the way it resonates the most is by hearing the stories of organizations that were struggling with a variety of different workforce issues: high attrition, low levels of customer experience and satisfaction, companies struggling with sales conversion, so on and so forth. Those are the problems that a platform like ours is really geared to address. And then finally, we're going to peer under the hood, and I want to help everyone understand how exactly it works, and ultimately what sort of decisions and insights this platform enables in order to engage in what we call data-driven, evidence-based decision-making around the workforce. So just to add to what we had already heard from Mike, why engage in big data and predictive analytics? Well, it's because it drives better financial and operational performance. And what we presented here are results from a survey that was conducted by Bain. They surveyed a large number of Fortune 500 companies, and they asked them first about their maturity with respect to their big data and predictive analytics capabilities. And then they also surveyed them on a number of different factors, for example, that essentially were organizational outcomes. Now they divided those companies into 5 groups, ranging from what they call, quote unquote, the bottom feeders to the top performers. Those are organizations that had very, very mature big data and predictive analytic capabilities that were very much on the forefront of this movement. And when they compared the best to the worst, there were a number of trends that really jumped out. First and foremost, the best organizations were 2 times more likely to exhibit top quartile financial performance over time. They were actually 5 times more likely to make decisions more quickly. They were more agile. They were able to adapt very quickly to changing business environments. They were 3 times more likely to execute on those decisions capably. So ultimately, not only were they making the decisions, but their operational strategy was aligned and they were able to make those changes very quickly. And then finally, they were 2 times more likely to use the data to make those decisions. And what we think is that those decisions ultimately are more likely to be the correct one if they're informed by the data. So how does this apply to the workforce? And how can we really use this big data and these predictive analytics to optimize the workforce? Well, there's essentially a 3-step process to doing so. And first and foremost, it starts with the data itself. And so ultimately, to optimize your human capital, as Mike had mentioned, that's your most valuable resource, particularly within service-providing organizations. We need to pull in historical HR and performance data. And so that means capturing data from those different silos that Mike had mentioned earlier. On top of that data, we're going to layer in predictive analytics and data science. And so we're going to apply state-of-the-art econometric models in order to understand what is driving performance with the workforce. And we're not just going to look backwards, we're actually going to be looking forwards. And we're going to try to understand what are the trends we can anticipate, what is our turnover going to look like in the next month, quarter, year, and what are the knobs and levers that we can use in order to improve attrition and performance. And ultimately, the goal is in that third panel to drive business performance. Now, to be clear, our company doesn't go in and say, this is what you should care about, and these are the metrics you need to monitor. That's ultimately up to clients that we engage with. They will come to us and say, what we care about is sales and revenue achievement, or where we really struggle is brand recognition and customer experience, or we just want to keep people longer. We want longer employee tenure. We have too many people in a revolving door type of arrangement, and we need to keep people longer because we know they'll provide superior levels of service. And similarly, if efficiency is the concern, if we want people to be able to handle transactions quickly and to do their jobs quickly and effectively, that's another metric. So the idea is that all of those are amenable to these approaches to managing and optimizing the workforce. Our job isn't to tell our clients and companies what they should care about. Our job is to help them achieve high levels of performance across any number of these metrics. So a little bit about Evolv, and I should take a step back and explain that, again, we're a company that's focused on that workforce optimization using big data and predictive analytics. We're optimizing workers across 20% of the Fortune 100. And we've displayed here a number of logos of organizations that we've worked with. These are a number of household names. You know, at the bottom, unfortunately, we actually aren't permitted to disclose a large number of our clients because, as Mike had mentioned, they believe this confers to them a certain amount of competitive advantage, and they actually don't want to alert their competitors to the fact that they're utilizing our platform. So suffice it to say, those companies that we mentioned at the bottom are all large household names that everyone would recognize. We're also very proud of that by the fact that we were recognized by Fast Company as one of the world's most innovative big data companies in 2014. So we really think that we're pushing the horizon here. So in terms of how it works, ultimately that platform, this gear in the middle, there's 3 foundations to it. There's the big data machine learning, and that's sucking in data from all of our clients, which is essentially a massive network of workforce data. So we're able to amalgamate all of those different organizations and generate sample sizes essentially in the millions and tens of millions of employees. On top of that, we layer workforce science, which is essentially drawing from IO psychology. We have a team of IO psychologists that have PhDs that are trained to get inside the heads of employees and figure out what makes them tick. And on top of that, we layer predictive analytics. So those are econometric models that we've borrowed from the literature and ultimately enhanced in order to generate and look forward at what are the trends we can anticipate within the workforce, how can we use knobs and levers in order to adjust our performance and to anticipate changes. The goal, again, is to take an approach that's an evidence-based, data-driven approach to managing the workforce, and that's throughout the life cycle of your employees. So what I'd like to say is that there are decisions that occur to your employees throughout their life cycle. The most obvious decision is who to hire. It's who to bring in, and that's where assessment companies come into play. But where we think we're unique is that we're also optimizing decisions beyond that point of hire. So how do we train people and who to train them? What sort of curriculum to use? What sort of managers should they be assigned to, and what teams should they be on? What's that team composition? What are the shift and wages that we want to apply to these people? What sort of overtime policy should we have in place? All of these decisions are decisions that can be made based on gut instinct and intuition, but we think that ultimately they're done better and in a more optimal way if data has been brought to bear. So let's not get too technical. What does this enable? Well, it enables us to make really interesting insights about the workforce. So we ask the question, what keeps people longer on the job? What enables them to perform better? And one of the insights we've generated is that workplace relationships are a huge driver of attrition and turnover. Quite simply, your manager is a stronger predictor of whether you stay or go than everything else combined. Now, IO psychologists have probably known this for years, but what's different here is that we can actually place a number on this figure. In fact, I'm speaking to a client later today in which we know that the amount of variance that managers account for is in the range of 38%. We've never had that level of precision before when we're talking to organizations. And so that really allows them to do data-driven decision making. Likewise, if we ask what makes a good manager, we could survey employees. We could ask them, what do you like about your manager? What do you dislike? I'm an economist. I naturally distrust survey methods. And when you gather traits of managers and you couple that with organizational outcomes, you get a much clearer picture of what makes managers thrive. For example, we found leadership teaching ability, no surprise there. Those are strong predictors. But the other factor that really matters is consistency. We've actually found negative effects amongst managers that are highly creative and outside the box thinkers. At the end of the day, when it comes to managing, employees really want someone who's a solid foundation, someone who they know what they're going to get from day to day. And so that helps drive not only your hiring processes about supervisors, but also training around how best to manage. So a few use cases. What are the problems that we would typically talk to our clients and engage with? I'll give you a few examples. First, we'll talk about Xerox, who's appeared in the media alongside Evolv. They came to us, and they're a global business process outsourcer. High turnover was really something they struggled with. It's that revolving door I mentioned. On top of which, especially for frontline employees, they wanted the interactions they had with customers to be more efficient. Essentially, they wanted them to be more productive, but they didn't want to sacrifice customer satisfaction. They wanted people to be handled quickly, efficiently, but ultimately with a high level of quality. Now, the hurdles they struggled with here were largely recruiting-based. They had a recruiting process that was very time-consuming and resource-intensive, and their hiring managers and recruiters were using criteria that was just subjective. It was their gut instinct and intuition. Not only that, but training expenses. When people left, especially when they left right after training, that's an incredibly costly hire. On average, the cost of replacing an employee ranges from $2,000 to $5,000 across organizations with large frontline workforces. And so as a result, they weren't meeting their performance goals. So another organization, this is a large global mobile network organization. So ultimately, they had a C-level initiative in order to reduce attrition. This was that important that their C-suite executives got involved. And not only that, but they recognized that within this telecom space, that customer satisfaction is key. That churn can be very high, especially when consumers have options. And so ultimately, they wanted to drive high customer satisfaction while ensuring that their employees didn't leave. Now, in this case, they had engaged in a number of different initiatives in order to understand their workforce attrition, but it was not a holistic approach. And so they had somewhat of a scattershot approach to all of these problems, but they didn't have one consistent approach to saying, what are the low-hanging fruit, where are the knobs and levers that we need to pull and dial in order to keep people longer and allow them to perform better. So another example, this is a global provider of insurance and financial services. In this case, they were focused on sales. High turnover amongst their sales representatives were preventing them from converting sales, from getting people into the funnel, and then ultimately allowing them to achieve revenue goals. They weren't meeting performance goals for satisfaction, and they wanted to improve sales. Again, they wanted to get people into the funnel and then ultimately improve their close rate. And so they didn't understand, unlike the last organization that had done a lot of different initiatives but didn't know where they should be focusing their effort, there's a company on the other side of the spectrum where they didn't really know what to start. They wanted to understand what are the projects we need to engage in first, second, third, and fourth in order to drive ROI. Ultimately, when we're doing these initiatives, we want small wins. We want to bolster those successes so that we can tackle bigger and bigger projects. So their question was very simple. Where do we even get started? And then finally, another large organization that we can't name, it's a large e-commerce provider. They actually had in place an intelligent, data-driven hiring process, but ultimately it had been homegrown. And so it needed to be updated and upgraded in order to accommodate a lot of the changes in data science and econometrics that had occurred over time. They wanted to reduce attrition, especially in very critical sites, and then not surprisingly, they wanted to provide a good customer experience and so that their brand perception would improve. Now, like I mentioned, they had homegrown internal tools and benchmarks, some of which worked decently well, some of which did not work at all, and they relied on largely subjective hiring criteria. Their recruiters and hiring managers didn't have any tool in place. They just chose people based on what they had chosen in the past. The goal was to focus their efforts and improve the quality of hire. So we've heard a lot of problems, and the good news is that it's not all gloom and doom, is that there are tools available in order to improve and help achieve certain milestones along the way. So I'll actually draw back on Mike's slide and take a page from his book, in that there are common concerns about the use of predictive analytics, and CFO Magazine actually highlighted this. So this is the conversation that you might hear between the CHRO and the CFO. And we had already covered all of these elements within the poll question we asked earlier. But the funny thing is, I did want to highlight, number 2 is the one we hear the most often. It was actually the winner of our poll. We don't capture enough data to do predictive modeling. What we tell clients that tell us that is, for better or for worse, you are already a big data organization. Assuming it's a moderate to large company with a certain number of employees, we find that, in essence, those data do exist. And they can be siloed, they may be in different elements of the organization, it may take effort to integrate them, but it is extremely rare, and often, I can't remember the last time we went in, did some sort of data due diligence and found, you're right, the data isn't here, there's nothing we can do. So the good news is that the data is there, and ultimately there are a number of other concerns that I think we can kind of level. And so when we talk about those concerns, Evolv's approach first, when we're talking about technical capabilities, is that we don't need to build up large armies of statisticians and econometricians. And that's essentially what we've done, is that we've taken IP out of the literature. Well, essentially, we've mined the econometric literature, we've borrowed those models, we've improved them, and then we've embedded that IP in the cloud. Time to integrate, time to value, and specifically data integration is a struggle, and it's not easy. But at the same time, because we've worked with a number of different organizations and we've integrated with virtually every data warehouse that you can imagine, it makes it so that data integration doesn't require a number of months or even years. We can actually do it in a number of weeks. And that means that before you even get started with the predictive analytics, that data integration piece that can often stymie these projects, that is something that is a non-issue. And likewise, when we're talking about people data, we need to get inside the heads of employees. We need to understand what makes them tick. And that's why we have those industrial organizational psychologists that I mentioned before. They're experts in understanding what keeps people around, what allows them to perform better. And so asking the right questions, there's a science to it. And asking the right questions is something that we're able to do. So another example, in this case, improving sales within a large wealth management company. In their case, they're very focused on 3 metrics: assets under management, certification pass rate, and retention. People had to pass a certain financial certification test, and once those brokers did, we wanted to keep them on the job longer. What we would do is integrate with them, aggregate and share data, pull data from industry aptitude scores, their HR management systems. We'd apply screening assessment data, sales performance, data from their learning management system, scorecards, and then we'd supplement that with macroeconomic and post-hire survey data. And then we generate insight from all of that. And there were a few insights that came out of it. One is we need a hiring screen. We need to assess people at the point of application and get the right raw talent in the door. We need to identify the traits of the best trainers. We found training is something that was a struggle. So we're going to get the best people into those training positions, and then we're going to optimize the curriculum. We're going to ask how much training, what sort of courses, in what order, and how long are appropriate, and use data in order to connect the dots and answer those questions. And then the key is iterating. It's using this process over and over again to really drill down and improve different elements of the organization. So another example, and I really want to highlight, there is one way to do this and one way alone, and that is by iterating. We start small and then we increase the scope of the engagement. So in that first step, we're actually talking right now about a claims adjuster position, essentially a company that was doing insurance type work. And they found there's a trade-off there between customer churn and also claims payouts. And you can imagine that going in too far in one direction or another can have different outcomes and impacts on the organization. Well, once we found that optimal level and that trade-off, then we want to dig into the workforce. First, we're going to understand relationships. We're going to optimize teams and ensure that supervisors that are in place are the best possible. They've been paired up with their employees properly. We're going to try to essentially improve the social network that exists within that work environment. Then we move on to training and development. That's that middle panel where we talk about what training works and what doesn't. Like I said, we want to get the right trainers in place. We want to ensure that they're coached as to how best to train. And ultimately, we want to get it so that people come out of training in as high a retention rate as possible, but also hit the floor and they're ready to do their job. Next, we'll talk about the raw talent. So we'll go in and we'll say, okay, what about the raw talent needs improving? Can we implement some sort of pre-hire screening process so that we can automate this process and ensure that the best talent is being put in those seats? And then finally, we can get really fancy and we can look at the personality of those claims adjusters, and we can match up customers with claims adjusters that we think would make a good pairing. And that's where really the rubber meets the road, is doing that sort of very advanced predictive analytics. And so to the use cases I mentioned earlier, there are good to happy endings to a number of these stories, and I'll share just a few. 39% improvement in retention of frontline employees. That's a huge number. 3.7% higher net promoter scores. Those are customers that are going away happy and ultimately going to be coming back to the well. 30 million plus in annual increase in subscription-based revenue retention. At the end of the day, you keep customers happy, you're able to close sales. That hits the bottom line in a very clear and direct way. 7% increase in new product sales. Again, it's sales conversion, and we've seen this applied to not only customer service, but also sales types positions. And finally, 820 avoided hires over a 3-quarter period. 820 might not seem like a large number, but consider the fact that the average cost of replacing an employee ranges from $2,000 to $5,000. When you multiply that number by 820, you actually end up with millions in savings as a result of the deployment of one of these platforms. So with that, I did want to leave some time for Q&A, but I want to thank everyone for hearing me out, and Joe and Mike for joining me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Housman. And indeed, we have received a lot of great questions from attendees. I think the classic question, just to follow up on an earlier part of your discussion, Dr. Housman, has to do with correlation and causation, or rather the typical, all too typical perception that correlation is synonymous with causation. So, for example, to your earlier point about managers possessing certain traits and those traits being correlated to retaining employees, what have you found, for example, when you've explained to clients in terms of advising them how to interpret the information that they've gathered, and how have you counseled them on ensuring that they avoid the risk of associating correlation with causation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great question. So the first step is doing this sort of retrospective data analysis, right? So it's mining the data already in your possession and looking for interesting trends, not unlike the one I had mentioned around supervisors possessing certain traits, being consistent and reliable for their employees. Now, with that said, we don't know exactly what's causing that, right? There could be a number of different causal factors that we could come up with to explain why those individuals tend to keep their employees longer. So typically the next step is to engage in smaller experiments. Now, armed with that insight, we can design small experiments where, for example, we change our hiring process in a few locations at first, just to pilot this approach. And maybe we look for supervisors that we think fit the right mold. And then we monitor those people and we see in that site where we've deployed this approach, do we see increased retention? If that's the case, then we know we're onto something right, and we know that that's a causal inference because we made a change and there was a change that resulted from it. And so that's typically how this sort of work goes, is first mining data retrospectively, identifying these trends. We can come up with plausible explanations, but ultimately the real, where that rubber meets the road is when we make changes to our policies and we closely monitor how that influences our key performance metrics.
Thank you, Dr. Housman. And another question for you, actually, related to that particular finding, which has to do with the finding that employees are more likely to stay with organizations because of how they view their managers. In other words, managers do play a key role in employee retention. Have you found that to be consistent in the organizations that you've worked with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. We've found that in most of the organizations that we've engaged with, the percentage varied. I mentioned a company where it was 38%. I've seen it as high as 56%. It goes up and down depending on the work culture and the nature of the work and the company itself. But in general, we've found that to be the case. And I should highlight that it's not just manager relationships. We've looked at relationships with other coworkers, so what team you belong to, even things like co-location, who do you sit next to? And we found that those relationships do account for the lion's share of differences, variance in outcomes.
So in other words, it's relationships. The relationships play a key role. So certainly the relationship between an employee and a manager or a supervisor and a supervisee are crucial, but also relationships among employees.
Yeah, that's the punchline for me is no man is an island, and in most roles, these tend to be social types of positions where you go into an office, and when you like your coworkers and you enjoy working with them, you just naturally stay longer and you perform better.
A great point, Dr. Housman. And then finally, a question for you, Mike. We had talked earlier about how there was a divide, let's say, in terms of how finance people perceived big data or the applicability of big data to them. A divide, say, between IT, speak generally, and finance. And I heard you say that divide, that gap, is shrinking. Have you found that to be the case, especially recently?
Yeah, I mean, the momentum is building in terms of people understanding that, and especially in that data I showed about the deeper insights through advanced analytics. People are realizing that it's about using these more advanced analytics techniques. It's not just, okay, I have more data and I can do more traditional reporting on it. Yes, that's true, you can, but it's also, it's the deeper analytics. Now, we showed that many technology people get it, They get that, all right, this is an extension to the existing approach, but also some new ways of doing things as well. But what the technology people often lack is the understanding of what is the business applicability. Like, what are those business use cases that you can actually use this technology? And that's the gap that needs to close before we really start to see predictive analytics take off across all organizations. We have another data point that I didn't show, that between 2012 and 2014, the use of predictive analytics has increased by 52% between 2012 and 2014, but it's still only used by fewer than 30% of the companies. So that's a perfect storm, because that means that there's rapid momentum in terms of using predictive analytics, but there's still a lot of opportunity for firms who haven't even approached it yet.
Well, that's a great point on which to ultimately conclude our webcast, and acknowledging the opportunity for organizations to apply predictive analytics, especially with regard to their workforces. And I want to acknowledge we've received a lot of great questions from attendees, and we may not have had the opportunity to address all of them during our webcast today, but we will plan to follow up on any remaining questions after this webcast. Also want to note that this webcast will be available on demand toward the end of next week within the webcast section of CFO.com. Before we wrap up, first of all, we want to thank our distinguished speakers. Also want to thank you, attendees, for joining us. And what we will now do is display an online feedback survey. You will be able to view and respond to the survey within a separate browser window if you have turned off your pop-up blocker during this webcast. And of course, we appreciate your feedback. Once again, I'm Joe Fleischer, moderator of our webcast, and on behalf of our distinguished guest speakers, and once again, they are Mike Gualtieri, Principal Analyst serving Application Development and Delivery Professionals with Forrester Research, and Dr. Michael Housman, Chief Analytics Officer with Evolv. We all very much appreciate your joining us for our webcast, Predictive Analytics for the Workforce, what CFOs need to know. Brought to you by CFO Publishing and by the sponsor of our webcast, Evolv. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.